know everything today and believe almost nothing. Jesus' most well-known teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't just reform our world, it recreates our world, using not just words and concepts, but living images that grab your soul. Join Sycamore Creek as we spend 5 weeks living into the Sermon on the Mount using Richard Rohr's book, Jesus' Alternative Plan. Alongside the series, you're invited to join a small group reading Jesus' words yourself. You'll find that it is not what you know that matters or changes anything. It is what you believe, and believe all the way through.
Have you ever been backstage at a major performance? Like sometimes you can get a backstage tour of a television show when you visit studios. When I was very young, I got the chance to visit the set of the original Star Trek series, except that I only had ever watched The Next Generation, so I tried to do the Picard style, like engage in Captain Kirk's chair. Now I looked far and wide for that picture, but I couldn't find it. There's something though about going backstage at a production that increases your appreciation for the performance. You start to see all of the things that go into making a performance great. The costumes, the makeup, the set design, and all the people that make those things happen. You start to have an idea of how great it might be. Like if you've already seen the performance, you have an idea. But then somewhere in your head, you know that there are costume changes and set changes and props that people need. But then to see it all backstage and how it all fits together can be mind-boggling. We're backstage at Stage 1 today, and Peppermint Creek Theater Company is in the middle of their performances of Beautiful, the Carole King musical. The show is running September 6 to 8, 12 to 15, and 19 to 22. We all have different levels of familiarity with Carole King. Some of you are familiar with her and you don't even know it because you've heard her songs and you didn't realize they were hers. For instance, you heard Where You Lead and you only know it from the Gilmore Girls intro. That's me. Others are familiar with her discography and could list off a bunch of songs right now. And then others might be familiar with the story of her life, or maybe you really know this particular musical. We have different levels of familiarity with Carole King and this production. And going behind the scenes can deepen our understanding of the production. We all also have different levels of familiarity with the person who is Jesus. Some of our understanding is pretty surface level, like he was a good guy and a good teacher, and we can learn some stuff from him. Some of us have been following Jesus and studying his words for a long, long time. And then there's everything in between. Today, we're going to take some time to go behind the scenes, to look backstage, as it were, to get a better understanding of the richness of his words and the depth of his teaching. Because the good news of our scriptures, the gospel, is the effect of encountering the real God. It's the transformation that happens to us when we encounter the real Jesus. And then our preconceived notions, they're just one thing that keeps us from that transformation because we don't really know the real Jesus. Our preconceived notions make it more difficult to understand Jesus and his teachings. The things we've heard about Jesus can cloud the picture rather than clearing it up. Well, if we really want to understand who Jesus was and what he was teaching, we have to try to come with new eyes. Without new eyes, Jesus looks like the guy we've known our whole lives, who rarely rocks the boat, instead of the surprising, came out of left field guy he really was. He looks ordinary and unremarkable until we realize that he was actually very unusual. Today, we're going to go behind the scenes so that we can get a better look at this unusual Jesus. But let's pause here for a chat question. Have you ever gone backstage on a television or some kind of performance set? Turn to someone around you or put it in the chat. Take a minute and talk about it. Last week, we started the series, Jesus Alternative Plan. It's based on a book by Father Richard Rohr. Rohr is a Franciscan friar and an author, teacher, and mystic. And this book is an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, giving us background information, setting the stage so that we can see Jesus with fresh eyes. And this series is kicking off an 18-month-long deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. Over the next 18 months, we'll have series after series that's inspired by the topics in Jesus' famous sermon. Now, you might be wondering why we would do this instead of having one series focus on the sermon or a specific book like we usually do. Well, every time the idea of doing the Sermon on the Mount came up in our series planning meetings, we had a sense of needing much longer than 4 to 6 weeks to do these 3 chapters in Matthew justice. But going line by line through 3 chapters over the course of 12 to 18 months isn't really our style either. So we've come up with different topics that are inspired by the words of this sermon, topics that will challenge us to not only believe with our hearts, but live with our bodies the transformation of the good news that Jesus shares. This week, we'll be getting to know the unusual Jesus in 2 ways. We'll be finding Jesus in the Gospels and then looking at a new social order. Starting with finding Jesus in the Gospels, we have to ask ourselves, who is Jesus Christ? Well, we tend to say Jesus Christ as if Jesus is his first name and Christ is his last name, like his family name. But in many ways, Jesus is the historical man of Nazareth who walked the earth. And the Christ is the identity that is put on Jesus, like his title. There are all kinds of assumptions and ideas that we put on top of Jesus, and even that we put on top of the texts of our scriptures. So part of finding Jesus lies in understanding our scriptures, how they function, why they were written, and understanding those things more clearly. The particular text we study when we look at the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew's account of Jesus' life and ministry, in what we call the Gospel of Matthew. Many of us consider the Gospels to be literally factual. Every account accurately recorded exactly as it happened. But then we don't stop to ask how Matthew knows what happened when Jesus went out into the wilderness after he was baptized. And it seems like somehow the author has gone back and pieced together all the events that happened when he wasn't around with great accuracy. But the thing is that when we do that, we're imposing our own understanding of this account onto the texts. We're assuming that if the account is communicating truth, then everything must be literally factual. But the point in studying the scriptures is this, that the story is always true, and sometimes it really happened. Did you catch that? The story is always true, and sometimes it really happened. The story tells us some kind of truth about the world, about God, about humanity. And sometimes the stuff in the truth literally happened. These accounts of Jesus' life and ministry were recorded 70 or 80 years after he lived among humanity. So the written accounts are the unfolding of the story as those who loved and followed Jesus understood his words 70 or 80 years later. The stories are presented by the faith communities in their context, given their biases, given their problems and their needs. So the Gospels are not presenting the historical Jesus for the most part. But then again, they're not entirely ahistorical either. We believe that the Spirit was guiding this community as it developed its belief in the historical Jesus. And that's how we get from a peasant proclaiming the reign of God in Nazareth through mythic imagery, Jesus of Nazareth, to the year 100, where we have the divine Son of God walking around calling himself the Son of God. And that's Jesus, the Christ. The Gospels were written in like 3 stages. Stage 1 is the historical event itself, what actually happened. And stage 2 is the very specific situations in the communities. Like Matthew was writing to a middle-class community, and Luke was writing to a poor community, and that affects their pastoral concerns. And then stage 3, the Gospels were composed by evangelists and their disciples according to the needs and understandings of their time and place, decades after the historical life of Jesus. So our act of faith, and it is an act of faith, is that all three stages are in fact divine revelation. So this sermon, the one that we call the Sermon on the Mount, was probably an actual sermon Jesus gave. And then Matthew used the historical event of that sermon to address the issues in the community he was writing to, using his own pastoral concerns. He uses the sermon writing to a middle-class community to remind them that the church and Christianity was always meant to be underground, working from the margins on the low road. Rohr says that we need to find a way to disestablish ourselves, to identify with our powerlessness instead of our power, our dependence instead of our independence, and our communion instead of our individualism. Unless we understand that, the Sermon on the Mount isn't going to make any sense. And he goes on to say, powerlessness, as best as I can read the Gospels, is the worldview of Jesus. Without emptiness, there can be no fullness. Without a beginner's curiosity, there can be no learning. Only those who possess nothing can be entrusted with everything. Without a beginner's curiosity, there can be no learning. That's what we're trying for today as we look behind the scenes for the unusual Jesus. So let's pause here for a chat question. Talk about a time when you had a beginner's curiosity about something. Tell about that experience. Turn to someone around you or put it in the chat. So we've been talking about the unusual Jesus and finding Jesus in the Gospels. And now we're talking about a new social order. If powerless really is the worldview of Jesus, well, it's helpful for us to understand the social order from which he was teaching. How was power organized? Who had power? That will help us to understand his teaching more clearly. So we're going to look at the social order of Jesus' time in two ways. One, through power and access, and two, through food and community. So starting with power and access. The culture of Jesus' day was marked by patronage. A patronage society is all about who you know and the loyalty of that system. So if you're an average person with a patron, then you know someone who's connected, someone who has wealth and power and can leverage it on your behalf. In return, you offer them loyalty in how you speak about them and in the things that you do. I mean, think about places in England where like a lord or a lady, like Downton Abbey, right? They have an estate that employs most of the people in the town. They have resources and connections and power, and they provide for the people in the area. Well, in Jesus' times, this well-established system of patronage meant that in day-to-day life, when you needed something, you needed another person to help you. And that included when it came to religious life. In order to access a relationship with God or forgiveness or becoming clean after being unclean, you needed to go through a priest. The priest was the go-between, like a patron, who could help you gain access to God. And now, as Rohr says, Jesus is in effect our great patron who stands between us and God. He tells us we can trust God because God is like him. This is a really big deal. Jesus is telling people that God is accessible to everyone, that God is available in reality itself, in experience itself, in the world of grace relationships. Like, we don't need to go through the brokerage system or the patronage system in worship. In Jerusalem, there was a watertight system for getting into the temple and getting sins forgiven, for getting worthy, for declaring who's in and who's out. And now they had this joker, John the Baptist, out in the desert saying, God is just as available as water. And God can raise up children of Abraham from these very stones. No wonder the religious establishment wanted him dead. And Jesus going into the wilderness to be baptized is demonstrating that he's accepting the new world order to which John the Baptist is pointing. Now, consider our current world order. In the United States, our social order is wealth. Status in our society is attained by having money and the freedom to use it. You have influence, a platform, access to power when you have wealth. In a society like Jesus's, status was achieved through the honor-shame system. And that's the key to many of the examples that he uses in the Sermon on the Mount. The honor-shame system is driven by what other people think of you, whether you're staying in the lines within expectations. It's an extraordinarily successful system when it comes to controlling behavior. Like when you're expected to respond in a certain way, something like exacting revenge on someone who hurt you, and you choose not to, you lose honor and experience shame. So the culture that Jesus was teaching to was primarily concerned with the question, how does my village see me? How do the people around me see me? American culture is primarily concerned with the question, what do I feel about myself? And Jesus is challenging us to ask, who am I really before God? It's not self-focused, it's not others-focused, it's God-focused. In Matthew chapter 5, in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, there are a series of teachings that Jesus shares with the crowd with the format, you've heard it said, but I say to you. You've heard it said, do not commit murder. But I say to you that if you experience anger in your heart, you'll be subject to judgment. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust in his eyes has committed adultery with her in his heart. You have heard it said, do not break your oath. But I say to you, do not swear an oath at all. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. When the culture is fixated on what the village sees in me, the outward parts of our actions become the most important things. Murder, adultery, oath breaking. But Jesus is inviting them to consider who they are before God. What's going on inside their hearts? Honor is excellence that's recognized by society, and therefore self-image and human value are forever shaky, changing, and unreliable. Jesus is moving this society from outwardly visible actions to inward truth, to find their value in God alone. And only prayer lets you realize that who you are is who you are in God before anybody thought anything, before you thought about whether you were good or bad, before anybody else thought about whether you were good or bad. Let's stop here for a chat question. Have you ever had a patron or been a patron for someone else? This could be in all kinds of different places. Take a minute and talk about it. So we've been talking about how to find the unusual Jesus, and we started with finding Jesus in the Gospels. And then we moved on to a new social order. We talked about a new social order in terms of power and access, and now we're going to talk about it in terms of food and community. Food and community are a way of talking about like what happens when we eat together, a dinner party, a potluck, a social gathering, even receiving communion together. Food and things like eating, preparing, preserving, planning is an integral part of every society. It's an integral part of being human. And Jesus had a lot to say about it. Sharing food is a complex interaction that symbolizes group relationships and defines group boundaries almost more than any other daily event. There are all sorts of unspoken rules, expectations, and anxieties that swirl around food. Think about the drama that happens around the fridge in the staff workroom. Is your food labeled? Did somebody take it? Did someone sabotage it? Is it growing something that could eventually kill a grown man? Or think about going to an event and you know there's going to be food. Are they appetizers or a full meal? Do I have to eat ahead of time? Are they going to have something I like? Or what about allergies and food aversions and how they're perceived? Like if I explain an allergy or a food aversion, will people be polite to my face and then roll their eyes about how difficult I am when I'm gone? Allergies can be something that keeps a person from participating in community food events. And there's not only the food itself, but then there's also the question of who is at the table. Navigating whom to invite to various events can be overwhelming. Like when a kid has a birthday party, do you have one event for family, friends, and everyone? Or do you have separate events for different spheres of relationships? Who do you invite to these things? The mystery of sharing food and a common table takes place on all kinds of different levels. It's the food you eat, the arrangement of the table, who's preparing and cleaning. The table becomes a symbol of how our social world is arranged. And Jesus' most consistent social action was eating in new ways. He ate with people that surprised his peers. He was often coming or going to a meal when he was stopped to heal someone. And in the midst of all that eating, he announced the reign of God and spoke in new ways. Jesus didn't want his community to have a social ethic. He wanted it to be a social ethic. Jesus didn't want his community to just follow the letter of the law that they had been given in the Hebrew scriptures. He wanted them to embody it, to live it out. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' interpretation of the law in terms of the God whom he has met. And that God is always about compassion and mercy. Rohr says, if you forget the rest of this book, please remember just this. Religion is all the things you normally go through to meet God. The gospel is the way you will see and think after you have met God. The gospel is the effect of the God encounter. Religion, though it often stirs desire, is also the most common and disguised way of avoiding the encounter. The gospel is how you're changed after you encounter God. It's what lets you embody these commands. It changes you. And perhaps most radically, Jesus is asserting that everyone has access to this gospel. In the accounts of Jesus' life and ministry, wherever you read that term sinners, it simply refers to the people who can't do it right. Very often because they can't afford the temple fees. There was a whole system of seeking forgiveness with the sacrifice of an animal that you had to purchase. So when Jesus jumped in and healed people or forgave their sins, well, somebody just lost their commission down at the temple. Jesus is transferring what was normally done in the temple to the home, redefining boundaries and the availability of holiness. Jesus is turning things upside down. He's not just reforming society, he's turning it inside out. He's rebuilding it from the ground up. And somewhere along the way, we lost the plot. We lost sight of just how revolutionary his teaching really is. The gospel is not primarily a set of facts, but a way of seeing and a way of being in the world because of God. Jesus speaks to the heart saying, God is on your side. God can be trusted. The universe is safe and benevolent. Trust yourselves, one another, and God. There's no reason to be afraid, and it's all heading towards something good. Some days, I can't say that I agree with all 6 of those statements. A lot of days, it's really hard. But if I can hold on to 1 and 2, God is on your side and God can be trusted, I can find peace in the midst of everything else that feels topsy-turvy. When we look behind the scenes of Matthew's account of Jesus' life and ministry, we begin to see how radical, how challenging, how inclusive, and how unusual Jesus was. When we encounter the true Jesus, we encounter God. And as we embark on this journey through the Sermon on the Mount, it's my prayer, it's our prayer, that all of us would encounter God, and that the way we see and think and move through the world would be changed as a result of that encounter with a God who is good and on our side and is all about compassion and mercy.